Harry, we've had the whore of Babylon and some sense of who she may represent, and that really continues in chapter 18 as we learn more about her and her fate. But the striking thing, first of all, is the song about the whore of Babylon begins, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great." But if Babylon is a kind of signal for Rome, when this is written, Rome's not fallen, it's going strong.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, we have an interesting overlap of real time and imagined time. I think it's one way of thinking about it. And this notion that Babylon has fallen was already articulated way back there in chapter 14, where we had an angel making that proclamation. In some ways, it's tied into the already not yet dimensions of the book of Revelation that we've seen from chapter 11 on. Where the victory of God is being celebrated even though it's not apparent. And this is one of the paradoxes of Revelation. It's talking about end-time events that have taken place and that are a reality even though they're not visible to the human eye. They're only visible through the eyes of faith, the eyes of worship that participate in a vision of heavenly reality that lies behind, surrounds, and undergirds the reality that we confront as suffering human beings. So I think the same sort of thing is going on here. There's a declaration in chapter 18 that the power that's embedded in Rome, which our author sees as a very diabolical power for all sorts of reasons, because it's involved in idolatry, because it's involved in economic exploitation, that power has already been defeated, even though that hasn't happened yet as a historical reality. We've talked before about whether the author thinks in terms of some sort of short-term political reality that will undermine Roman authority, or whether he's thinking simply on a spiritual plane, that the existence of this new community of kings and priests, people who are kings because they are priests, undercuts the old reality. And I think he's mainly making the latter affirmation, but the other is there. So chapter 18 is the last part of the, we can call it the Whore of Babylon interlude. And after that, we get another sequence of unnumbered visions. And we're going to talk a little bit about the first of those in chapter 19, starting in verse 11.
All right, so what does the seer see?
Well, the seer sees there the heaven opened. The heavens get opened on a regular basis in the book of Revelation, and something important happens every time the heaven gets opened. And there, a rider on a white horse comes through. And we're going to have to talk about that rider on the white horse in a minute or two, but I want to spend another minute or two on Babylon and its fall.
Okay, good.
A couple of points to be made about that. The imagery here comes out of the Old Testament. And what we have is a massive use of material from Ezekiel 26 and 27, which is an old prophetic form of, in effect, a taunt song talking about the fall of an enemy of ancient Israel, the city of Tyre, a merchant city. And so all of the imagery connected with Tyre as a merchant city resurfaces here. And the people who are lamenting the fall of Babylon include shipmasters and seafarers in verse 17.
Yeah, it's quite amazing.
And what they do, the merchants of the earth who lament the fall in chapter 18, verse 11, do all sorts of things. And we have a catalog of what they do in those verses, 11, 12, and 13. And it's an amazing set of stuff that reminds you of Fifth Avenue or Madison Avenue in New York, right?
Mercantile heaven.
It's interesting where it concludes. After all of these luxury goods, we have trafficking in human beings, in slaves. And in some ways, that epitomizes what's evil about Babylon as a mercantile enterprise. It subordinates human beings to profit in a very inimical way. So one of the things that I think our author is celebrating is the defeat of that kind of power, that kind of satanic influence over people like himself.
That's good. And with it, the martyrdom of the martyrs, so that
that's right.
The various ways in which the cost of all this prosperity is humankind, finally.
And if there's one way of thinking about the relevance of this book to our own day and effort, it's the engagement in issues of social justice on the part of Christian churches. they ought to be, we ought to be concerned about the way in which economic exploitation takes place and the way
and
in
the
which
human
people
toll. Yeah.
are enslaved by
Yeah,
it.
absolutely.
And be committed, as this author was, to dispensing with it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So in any case, we have the merchants and shipmasters and all lamenting the fall of Babylon, and then we have a celebration of
Yeah.
its fall.
Yeah.
Another kind of
Hallelujah.
hallelujah chorus.
Yeah.
In fact, we get a hallelujah.
Right at the beginning.
Yeah, and in chapter 19, verse 1, and chapter 19, verse 6. So it's and verse 4. It's
Yeah.
hallelujahs all over the place
hallelujah.
about this fall of Babylon, and the things that have already been achieved: salvation and glory and power to our God, for His judgments are true and just, in verses 1 and 2. So it's the author is celebrating the judgment of God that he and his like
Yeah.
have made on the forces of evil, and it's in that judgment and in the proclamation of that judgment, I think, that he sees victory taking place, even at the cost of the human suffering that comes as a result of that.
That's very good. And our man on the white horse?
Man on the white horse. See, all of this judgmental stuff earlier on, I think, is relevant to the man on the white horse. This is clearly a picture of the warrior Messiah. Right, and we have images of warrior messiahs in Jewish texts, like the Psalms of Solomon, Psalm 18, and so it's part of the heritage that this author is working with. And this guy seems like a warrior. He comes in with a diadem on his head. We'll talk about that in a minute. He's clothed in a robe dipped in blood, and that seems like it's going to make him a warrior. And he comes equipped with a sword with which he strikes down the nations, and with a rod of iron with which he's going to rule. All of this sounds very militaristic, doesn't it?
It does.
But I think in some ways that's an ironic portrayal of a warrior Messiah.
Say more about
because the sword that he wields is the sword that comes out of his mouth.
Yeah.
It's the word that he
Yeah,
speaks,
yeah.
which is like the word of judgment that was celebrated
Yeah.
in the previous chapter, the word of witnessing that was celebrated much earlier on in the middle of chapter 12 and 13, right? In the little celebratory hymns there. So this warrior Messiah conquers precisely as the people throughout the book of Revelation are called to conquer by their testimony, by their witness.
And martyrdom, finally.
And the robe that's dipped in blood, I think, is not dipped in the blood of enemies, but it's the blood of the Lamb.
Real interesting.
It's through that blood that he makes his witness, makes his claim on the people who are called to be this priestly kingdom. And this rider on the white horse does have a name, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, on his robe and on his thigh. It sounds an awful lot like the name that's above every name. That is the end of the famous hymn in Philippians 2,
very much so.
that Christ exalted to the right hand of God after emptying himself and dying on the cross is given that divine name, the Lord. And so insofar as deity is present to us, it's present to us through the Lamb that was slain. Insofar as he is the saving eschatological Messiah, it's through his salvific death that he is, and that discloses the presence of God. I think that's what this text is saying.
That's very powerful. But it's genuine power, just not the way we usually think of power. This really is King of Kings. Right. No, that's very, very good. Tell me about the wedding.
Well, the next image is the great feast, the great supper of the Lord. Our author delights in ironies, there's no doubt about that. And what he's celebrating here is, again, a kind of anticipatory, a proleptic celebration of divine victory that takes place, I think, in the supper that's prepared for the faithful, the Eucharistic assembly. I think there's an allusion to that, and it's in that meal that victory takes place. But we have these bizarre images of the beast and the kings of the earth being captured and torn up, etc. And this is much more negative imagery, but it's the same kind of negative irony that I think we've seen all the way along.
Okay. So what do we take away from this interesting passage?
Well, I think the connection between what we saw in part 2 of the interlude, the fall of Babylon, and the proclamation of the coming of the Messiah are integrally related. And especially that image of the coming of the Messiah is not a prophecy of something that's going to happen in the future. It's a celebration of what's happened in the past.
Yeah.
And that's key to the whole book of Revelation. The Lamb that was slain is the key to understanding human existence and human history, and that Lamb that was slain is this Messiah, whose bloody cloak is his own blood.
Very powerful. Thank you, sir.
Mm-hmm.